Good morning, Epic United. It's great to be together in the Lord's house this morning. I'm so glad that you're here to worship God and to encourage somebody else, perhaps, in the Christian faith. There's a lot of places we could have been today. Well, I don't think there's any better place to be than right where you are, right where we are together. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share the Word of the Lord, the Bible, with you this morning. And you'll see some sermon outline notes in your bulletin that you received today. So if you want to take that out, and I think maybe we got some house lights that are going to come up. So if you want to take some notes, sometimes people find that that really helps put the dots together for them and sometimes helps them remember some important things that they'd like to remember if they both listen and write those things down. So we've got some sermon notes for you. We're going to try to do that for you every Sunday, and I just hope that it helps. Give us some feedback. If you don't want to do it, we certainly won't do it. But we've heard some comments that those sermon notes are helpful, so you may want to use those. We're continuing on this morning, looking together at a series that we're calling Living Out an Easter Sunday Faith in a Good Friday World. You know, sometimes this whole world seems more like Good Friday, doesn't it? We hear crazy things like what happened at the Boston Marathon, and we hear about all these things that are happening in the world around us. Sometimes this world feels more like Good Friday, you know, where something really terrible is we wonder what's going to happen next. But as people of God, as Easter people, the people that we are as Christians, we know that we have an Easter Sunday faith that's even greater than the Good Fridays of this world. Remember what the Word says in the book of Ephesians. We've been reminding one another of this throughout the last several Sundays, and that is this, that the same power that raised Jesus Christ from the dead is at work in you. Never forget that. We can have an Easter Sunday faith even in this Good Friday world. The last couple of Sundays we've talked about some disciples who lived out an Easter Sunday faith. We talked about the disciple Thomas, who had some real doubts. Sometimes he's referred to as Doubting Thomas. Maybe more fairly we would call him Honest Thomas. When he honestly, confessed his doubts to the Lord, God used those doubts and helped him grow through those doubts into a person of some real authentic faith. And Thomas went on to be one of the great missionaries and evangelists of the early church, and eventually gave his life for his faith. Doubting Thomas became Faithful Thomas because he confessed that he had some honest doubts. Last week we looked at Mary Magdalene, who kept her faith even when her heart was breaking. We can imagine what she might have felt at the foot of the cross. And yet it was Mary Magdalene on that Easter Sunday morning who went and told the disciples she proclaimed the very first Easter Sunday sermon. She said, "I have seen the Lord." She became the apostle to the apostles. This morning we want to look together at the story of the apostle Peter. Peter, who had faith even when he didn't have a clue. Aren't you glad that the Bible is so honest about our heroes? Not all ancient literature, not all current literature is like that. Sometimes the historian tries to make the character look larger than life, but in the Bible, those characters come across very authentic and very real. People like Peter, who sometimes don't understand what Jesus is about. That makes me feel a whole lot better, because there's a lot of times I don't understand things in life. A lot of times I don't understand things about the faith. Sometimes I don't understand things about the Lord or about His Word. And when I read about people like Peter, Peter was such a great disciple. We owe him so much. We wouldn't be here today probably if it hadn't been for the faith of Peter. And yet time and time again throughout the Gospels, Peter is portrayed as someone who just doesn't understand what's going on. We think of Peter when he's up on the mountain with Jesus during the Transfiguration. Peter and James and John have gone up on this mountain. Jesus asked them to go, so they go. And there Jesus is transfigured before them, and Moses and Elijah are there. It's a very powerful scene when we read back on it. But when they're there, Peter is clueless. He doesn't know what to do or what it's all about. One time when they're walking by the temple in Jerusalem, Jesus points to the temple and says, "See this great, wonderful temple? In 3 days you can tear it down and I'll raise it back up." And they thought, what in the world? They didn't know he was talking about, his own death and how he was going to rise on the third day. They were clueless about that. They didn't understand what he was trying to teach them in that moment. And now in the story that we have in the Gospel of Matthew, we see time and time again that the disciples often don't understand the nature of Jesus' ministry. Sometimes he's eating with tax collectors who are not well liked. Sometimes he's wanting to spend time with people who are blind and lame and poor and struggling. And the disciples say, "Listen, Lord, you're an important guy. You need to be spending time with the leaders and with the kings and with the important people." Jesus says, "No. You don't understand. These are kingdom people." One time Jesus wanted to spend time with some children. The disciples tried to shoo the children away. And Jesus said, "What are you doing? Let the children come to me. Don't forbid those children, because I tell you the truth, unless you become like a child, you won't make it. You're not going to make it in my kingdom." Oftentimes they just didn't understand. And now, specifically this morning, we're going to look at a story where Peter and the disciples find themselves out on the Sea of Galilee. It's night time I don't know if you've been out on the water at night. Sometimes it can be a little creepy. And a storm has blown up, and so there's waves washing into the boat. Don't assume that just because some of them are fishermen that they all know how to swim. That would not be a good assumption. Many people 2,000 years ago did not know how to swim. They didn't have YMCA, swimming class, or a rec center where they could go to learn how to swim as kids. Don't assume that those disciples in the boat knew how to swim when you hear this story in just a moment. And to top it off, while they're at night, out on a boat, out in the middle of the lake, big storm, they think they see a ghost. And Peter's mind is just blown. Let's read the story from Matthew chapter 14, beginning with the 22nd verse. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into a boat and go on ahead to the other side of the lake, while he dismissed the crowds that they had been ministering to. And after he dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain to pray by himself. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, and the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. They were terrified. When they saw him, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you, to walk to you out on the water." Jesus said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, now think about this, when he noticed the strong wind and maybe the waves, he became frightened, and he began to sink, and he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him and said, "You have little faith. Why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind stopped, and those in the boat worshiped Jesus, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. A wonderful story. We can only imagine ourselves there in the boat with the disciples on that stormy night at sea.